God, I got so much to say. Okay, go ahead.
Excellent. I have so much to hear.
Live from the Talking Joe studios, it's Talking Joe.
Talking Joe is on the air.
Hey, it's me, Mark, and welcome to Talking Joe. Today we are doing something a little bit different. We are bringing you an encore presentation of Sean Jordan, aka Wordburglar's interview with Mike Costa. Now, this was originally broadcast as part of Codename Iowa's Armor 3 online convention in 2023, alongside many other video segments. Wordburglar also has a version of this video on his own channel, but the interview is so good that I wanted to share it with our audience, and Wordburglar very generously agreed to let us share it here with you. Now, a bit of introduction. So, this is a rare, extensive, and enlightening comics conversation with Mike Costa, focused on his seminal IDW Comics G.I.JOE work, Cobra The Last Laugh series. In this extensive Enterprises interview, Mike provided a lot of awesome insight into his stories, the origins of the comic, how he worked with co-writer Christos Gage, how he worked with Hasbro, the development of the characters, and so much more. As a bit of background for those less familiar with this series, Mike Costa's work on Cobra started with G.I. Joe issue 0 from IDW, which was the very starting point of the IDW Comics universe. That issue 0 spun off into G.I. Joe Cobra issues 1 to 4, which was initially a mini-series. It was followed by volume 2 of Cobra, issues 1 through 13, with 2 extra specials. The conclusion of that volume led into the Cobra Civil War, with a new series, volume 3, which ran for 21 issues. That then spun off into a further 9 issues called the G.I. Joe The Cobra Files, which wrapped up Mike Costa's amazing comics run on G.I. Joe. The initial run, along with co-writer Christos Gage and artist Antonio Fuso, was collected as Cobra The Last Laugh in a hard-to-find hardcover from IDW. This run represents the most significant G.I. Joe storytelling since the very early Marvel run from Larry Hama, so is indeed a very high watermark for recent G.I. Joe comics. Now, all of that intro aside, here's Burgie talking to Mike Costa.
Undercover, to expose the core. Go to extremes in the process. Undercover, to expose the core. The real definition of what a snake is.
I'm here with writer-producer, Chief Cobra Creative Officer, Mike Costa. You know, it's no secret that I'm a huge fan of Mike's work on IDW's Cobra comics series, among other things. And in my opinion, Cobra stands as easily one of the greatest runs in G.I. Joe comics history. When Cobra hit the stands, I don't think anybody saw it coming. It was called Cobra. Chuckles was on the cover for issue 1. What was this about? You know, I was intrigued. You know, no doubt, you know, he had me as a Joe fan, but I really had no idea what a treasure I had just stumbled on. And this series would give us chilling insights into the darkest corners of Cobra. Mike and the whole team gave us Shakespearean character-defining stories of Tomax and Zaymot, Chuckles, Jinx, Chameleon, Scoop, Serpentor, Globulus or Golabulas, Crystal Ball, Venomous Maximus, Firewall, Skullbuster, Crocmaster, Big Boa, Flint. You know, this is not exactly the most well-loved batch of G.I. Joe characters, you know, with a couple exceptions there, but definitely like a bit of a motley crew, and a lot of names that may not be familiar to people, unless you're me or many of the Joe fans watching right now. You know, I've always had love for the oddballs and have always wanted more, and I've always wondered, like, what is going on with Cobra, and, you know, thinking about all the inner workings here. And Mike and the team on Cobra made every one of these characters engaging and thrilling, tapped into the core of what makes them so fascinating. For lifetime G.I. Joe and comic book fans, Cobra was a much-needed breath of fresh air, and really, in a lot of ways, a dream come true. It was a comic we were waiting for. And then for people who didn't know anything about Cobra or G.I. Joe, this is really an accessible, enthralling, and unpredictable counterterrorism spy series with a lot of colorful criminals sprinkled throughout. And again, as a big comic reader myself, I would put this work right up against other comic contemporaries like Ed Brubaker, Brian K. Vaughan, Greg Rucka. Like, this sits proudly on the shelf next to those books. And Cobra gave us glimpses into these inner workings of Cobra, unlike anything we've ever seen, and took characters who may have seemed like jokes and turned them into the exact opposite. It was the Joe series we've been waiting for, and we've got Mike Costa to thank. And we've got Mike Costa right here. And Mike, I want to be cognizant of your time instead of just showering you with praise this whole time. And there's so much I want to talk to you about and hear about Cobra. So first of all, welcome. So,
Thank you for having me. It was I will never receive a greater intro probably for the rest of my life. It was overwhelming. Thank you.
Your contribution to the Joe mythology is, it's so high. It's in my, I hold it so high, and I'm so excited to talk to you. You can tell, and I know there's a lot of other people out there as well, because I talk to it all the time. It's no secret, I made a tribute to your work in the song "Chuckles the Last Laugh" on "Welcome to Cobra Island."
You were thinking all out war.
Yeah, that's right.
I remember that when you sent me that. It was very cool.
Well, I was honored that you even checked it out. So yeah, look, let's just dive right in, because I want to start really with IDW, and please feel free to go wherever this leads us. But looking back, it was 2008 when there was a G.I. Joe issue 0 came out, and it had a sampling of these 3 upcoming new series from IDW. And 2008, I think, again, we're speaking to G.I. Joe fans, it was an exciting year. The first ever live-action feature-length movie was finally in production. They had promised it was going to come out in 2009, so there was a lot of anticipation there. The line was exploding back on toy shelves. There were a lot of new action figures out there. There was a Warren Ellis animated movie that was coming, and IDW had secured the license to publish the new comics. And they'd already been publishing Transformers since 2005, and this would be the first time that the two Hasbro crown jewels were kind of back under the same comic publishing roof since the Marvel days. So there was a lot to get excited about for someone who had been following the G.I. Joe comics for a while. And these 3 series that started were G.I. Joe, G.I. Joe Origins, and the runaway hit Cobra, which you were a part of. And let's just start right there. How did you wind up working on America's favorite ruthless terrorist organization?
So I will tell this whole story. I don't know if I've ever told the entire story before. It's an important story in my career, even outside of Cobra, because it was really the start of my career. So previous to Cobra, I had only really written one comic. It was a 6-issue miniseries that I did for DC Comics for their Wildstorm imprint about Jack Hawksmoor from The Authority. And it's mostly notable because it was also the first mainstream work of Fiona Staples, who now draws Saga for Brian Vaughan. She had done a independently produced comic before that I think mostly it was available in Canada because she's from Calgary. Mm-hmm. I have those issues. I have never really seen them much, but her first mainstream work was Hawksmoor, so that was pretty rad because Fiona's really good. And I had been hired to write something else for. I was doing like a video game tie-in for the Resistance video game for Wildstorm, and I was doing another project that never came out because the artist, I don't know what happened. They freaked out. They died. I actually don't know, but the art never got completed. It never got finished. It was like a manga adaptation of a TV show that was popular at the time. It's a very strange project. But so Cobra was really my first thing that like people paid attention to. For a lot of the reasons that you said, I think because it was so unexpected. And the way that it happened, there's two people that were responsible for that. The editor at the time, whose name was Andy Schmidt, who I bizarrely just spoke to today. We just had a phone call today because I ran into him at Comic-Con a couple weeks ago. And he and I are still friends. We're in touch. And Christos Gage, who was a big writer at Marvel at the time and DC. He was a big superhero guy. I had met Chris that year at San Diego because I was at the Wildstorm party. San Diego used to be a lot cooler if you were a comic book creator. DC used to have a big thing, and Wildstorm specifically had their own party, and it was like a karaoke party, and I love karaoke. And Chris and I ended up singing a duet at karaoke, and that was Comic-Con of 08, I guess. And what happened was, or maybe it was 07, doesn't matter. It was the year before Cobra came out, because what happened was Andy Schmidt got hired by IDW to take over the Hasbro line, essentially, to take over G.I.JOE originally, but he ended up doing Transformers as well. And he had been a big editor at Marvel and did a bunch of stuff at Marvel. He did the Annihilation crossover at Marvel, which was a really big deal that relaunched Guardians of the Galaxy into the sort of current state that the movie sort of took from. And he had a previous relationship with Chris Gage, having worked with him at Marvel. So what happened was they bring in Andy to run G.I. Joe, and it's his idea to do 3 books. He wants to do a main book. He gets Chuck Dixon to write it. He does the Origins, which he had Larry Hama do because he wanted Larry involved. And then his idea was to do a book about Cobra, to do at least a miniseries about Cobra. And he approached Chris to write it. It was Christos. And Chris was very busy at the time. So Chris called me, who he just had met that one time. I think we had gone out to lunch also. And Chris knew that I was, young and new in the industry and looking for stuff. And he was like, hey, you're a little younger than me. It's funny because Chris is like maybe 5 years older than me, but he always would act like he was an old man. He's like, he's more your generation than mine. So if you're interested in doing G.I. Joe, we could work on this together because I really can't commit to it full time. And I was like, great. And he goes, yeah, so I'll put you in touch with Andy. And then that like an hour later, I spoke to Andy, and Andy was like, cool. We had never met, but Chris vouched for me. Great. And then Andy said, we're doing a 0 issue and I need 5 pages or whatever. Oh, and Andy also said it was Andy's original idea. His vision for the Cobra book was to be about an undercover Joe who infiltrates a terrorist organization that no one has ever heard of before. The Joes are unaware that Cobra exists at this point because we're doing a total reboot. And by the end of the miniseries, he specifically, I remember this, him saying specifically, it's like the scene in Alias where Sydney thinks that she's found like the limits of the organization, and then they roll out like a huge chart, and they're like, no, you've seen this much. It's all of this. And that's the moment he wanted for the end of the series. I remember him pitching me that. And I was like, cool, I can do that. And he was like, good, because we need, these 5 pages by next week. So I called Chris back. And I was like, I got the job. We're going to do it. He needs this, 7-page story or whatever it was. And Chris goes, oh, you're going to have to write that. I was like, I don't have time. You got to do that. So I was like thrown in the deep end right away. And it was my idea to use Chuckles. And I came up with Chuckles for a lot of the reasons that you mentioned earlier, which was like, I was intrigued by the idea that I didn't have to use the main cast. So I could pick random Joes and random people to be in my book. And that's super fun because there's a lot of weird Joes. So I specifically picked Chuckles because I remember him from the movie, the G.I. Joe cartoon movie. And what a ridiculous, he's just a guy in a Hawaiian shirt. Like there's nothing to that character. And I really liked that. And it wasn't until I had already decided to do it, and then I read his file card, that I found out he actually is undercover. He's an undercover. I didn't know that. I got very lucky. So it was Chuckles, and that's where it started. And I wrote those first 5 pages. And here's an Easter egg that probably some people have noticed. I don't know if you haven't, though. Now you know. If you go back and read those initial few pages, all of his aliases are various people from the Howard Stern show. Their names switched around because I was listening to a lot of Howard Stern at the time. So, like, I don't know. One of the last names is Lang from Artie Lang, but a lot of them are like Howard. And at the time, there was a couple people making Howard Stern references in comics. I know that Jim Lee was on the show a couple times, so I guess I felt like, oh, maybe he'll mention it. Like he finds out about it somehow, which never happened. But that was the first thing I ever wrote. I put a bunch of Howard Stern stuff in there, which now seems completely ridiculous for that show in years. And the way we ended up going forward was the way Chris and I worked was that I would write the script, and then he would go back and do. So I've worked in TV a long time, and in television, there's a term that we have where you do a pass, where you're writing for a TV show, and every TV show has a showrunner, and the showrunner is really like the person who has the vision for the show, but the people that work under them and the staff, they come up with ideas and they write scripts, and the showrunner does their pass where they sort of smooth it over. Sometimes it's a heavy pass and you change everything, and sometimes you barely change anything. And that's what Chris did on Cobra. I would write the scripts, and then he would go in and do a pass. And I remember the major change he made in the first issue was I didn't end the issue on a splash page, which I knew as I finished the script. I was like, this should be a splash page, but I couldn't figure out how to pace it right without cutting out something important. And he figured it out because, he's a veteran master. And that was like the biggest change I remember him making. So he had a pretty light hand. He really let me kind of drive it. I mean, if I made some horrible blunder or wrote something awful, he would fix it. I mean, it's not like he was checked out, but we worked in sync really well. And when we talk later about where the book went, there's stuff that Chris wrote entirely himself. It wasn't just all me. Like the Serpentor idea was entirely Chris. The whole concept of it as a cult, and Serpentor as a cult leader, and Golobulus is like the weird hybrid god, that was entirely him. And Scoop, I think, was his idea too. And also the Crocmaster issue. He wrote that solo. He was like, I want Crocmaster. So I never touched Crocmaster. He appeared in a couple issues that I wrote, but the main issue about him, Chris wrote that. That was important to him. So it's not like he wasn't involved, but he was very gracious. And I'm not telling any tales out of school. He tells this story also. I'm not trying to snake credit. He's always been so gracious, and he's 100% responsible for my career in this industry, because Cobra did get a lot of attention, which I never expected it to, and it really did launch my career.
Yeah. So how was the reception just right off, like from that first issue when it hit? Because like I say, it caught me by surprise. It caught a lot of people by surprise. We saw those Howard Chaykin covers that were great with Chuckles. It was like, but what is this? And we were kind of waiting. I think G.I.JOE came out first when the issue ones came out, and then maybe Cobra dropped third or second.
I think Cobra was third. I think Origins came out and then Cobra.
Yeah. And it was all very new. Like, there was a lot of speculation, like, what's IDW going to do with this? And I think even from the start, the G.I. Joe movie that was coming out used Heavy Duty instead of Roadblock, and there might have been some copyright things. I mean, there's a lot of stuff like that where it's like, oh, this is a little bit different. Like, I noticed little things that were just a bit different. Like, Jinx, for example, was Chinese-American.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas previously we knew that she was related to Storm Shadow and the Arashikage and Japanese. So I always wondered, like, was this built in as like a safety measure for Hasbro to say, oh, that's not the actual Jinx, like, we're going to use her later. So there was a bit of leeway to kill the character off. And again, we can talk about that a bit further, because I'm very curious about, I don't know how much you can talk about it, but from whether it was editorial or Hasbro, like, were there any things that you were told right from the get-go, you can't do this, oh, you can do this? Like, when you were picking characters and you picked Chuckles, did you have a list of characters you were allowed to choose? Did they say, don't touch these guys? No?
No, they didn't. I'm very comfortable talking about this, because the truth is, I was never told I couldn't do something. And, I'm assuming, hopefully 15 years later, if people are watching this, they've read at least the first miniseries, because there's a kind of crucial moment in the first miniseries where a major character in the miniseries is killed in a kind of a shocking way. And I came up with that idea, and I did the thing where you probably have heard the story where, like, directors will put some kind of really horrible thing in the cut of a movie so that when the ratings board sees it, they're like, you got to cut that out. But then it makes something else that they actually want to keep look fine in comparison. And it's like a trick that you pull. And so that was my idea. I was like, okay, I'm going to pitch this idea that this happens. And they're going to say no. But then I'll get to do something else that that will not be as intense, but still more than what you'd expect out of a G.I. Joe comic. Set the bar really high, and then when you come in under it, it's still high enough that it'll be, unusual. Because I definitely wanted the Cobra book to be dark and about like bad people doing bad stuff, and I wanted to take Cobra really seriously, and it was, looking back now, at the time, that was only the second or third thing that I had written professionally. And, this is not what you're ever supposed to say because it's the exact opposite of all the writing advice you get. But the truth is, I wrote a lot in college. And then after college, I barely wrote anything until I was actually hired to write my first comic. I was not one of these guys that's like constantly writing on his own, which all of my friends who are now very successful screenwriters, all of them were like that. And I was not. They were constantly having me read their stuff. I had nothing to show. So when I wrote Cobra, I hadn't written a whole lot of stuff. And it's only now that I have, and I look back and I realize like, oh, one of the things that I write about a lot unconsciously, though now consciously because I'm aware of it, are characters that are carrying around a tremendous amount of guilt, that they did something awful or they're responsible for something awful, and it's slowly sort of destroying them. And I think it must come from my Catholic background, my Catholic upbringing, because I never did anything awful, but clearly this is something in my mind that I have to exercise out. So that, I'm like, oh, I'm writing about a guy who's undercover with bad people. He's going to have to do something awful because I want to show the cost. This isn't the cartoon. This is something much more serious. So that's where that idea came from. And they just said, yeah. And I don't know how much of that was Andy running interference on Hasbro, Andy Schmidt, the editor.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I later became friends with the person who ran publishing at Hasbro, and everything went through him. He's this guy named Michael Kelly. He's a great guy. I think he's still at Hasbro. But that was years later. At the time, the only person I spoke to was Andy. Andy dealt with Hasbro. So, maybe Hasbro said to him, you can't do this. And he was like, I'm doing it. I don't know. I've never asked him about it. But all I know is when I said I wanted to do it, he said yes, and then it happened. Mm-hmm. And that was sort of the case with everything going forward, particularly what happened later in the series where I killed a major character. And I remember the day I came up with that. I wrote it in my notes document because I had horrible insomnia, and I was like, oh, this is what we're going to do. And I remember pitching that on a phone call with Chuck Dixon. And I knew that would be a big deal because it was a major character in the scope of. Should I be cagey or going to talk about it?
I think we can talk about. We're talking with G.I. Joe fans. We can Cobra Commander's who you're referring to,
Cobra Commander.
Right?
So I knew that after we finished the first volume of Cobra, the first 4 issues, we knew before it was done that we were going to do more, and that's when I came up with this idea that let's make it a trilogy. And in the third part of the second part of the trilogy will end with us introducing Cobra Commander because he had not been introduced yet in the main book or anywhere.
Yeah, and that's a big question I have, actually, because the slow rollout, as a reader reading all 3 books at the time, I was like, when are they going to get to what is going on here? Like, do they even know what they're doing? Yeah. I mean, it felt like it, but there was...
No, we
got more Destro, I think, in the other books than we got Cobra Commander, right?
Yeah, Chuck was using Destro as his main villain for a while, which was cool. And it let Cobra Commander... I mean, Chuck, we never discussed this, but I know that, his storytelling instincts were probably the same as mine, which was like, let's keep him off stage for as long as possible because everyone knows Cobra Commander. All the readers are waiting for him, so let's milk it a little. And I knew that it was a big ask to say, hey, rather than introducing the main villain of the entire franchise in the main book, let me do it in my comic. And my argument for it was, my comic is called G.I. Joe Cobra, so Cobra Commander should show up in the book. And then
good reason, good logic.
Yeah, and then on top of that, I was like, and then we're gonna kill him. We'll kill him And because I had already had this idea of who I wanted Cobra Commander to kind of be, and I didn't want him to be the cartoon version. I wanted him to be more of like an aristocrat, and this idea of like old money Euro trash guy. Like that's how I kind of saw him. But also, I knew that was a radically different kind of Cobra Commander, so I was like, but we'll get rid of him. Mm-hmm. And then we can bring on the more military terrorist Cobra Commander that we know, and this will be the way we do it, is we kill Cobra Commander. No one will see it coming. And that was another thing that I knew, like, that would be an uphill battle because that's a big thing to not happen in the main book. But God bless Chuck Dixon, and I will never, I owe him so much, just like all these other guys I'm talking about. On that phone call that I pitched all this stuff, because I came up with all of it at once and wrote it all down, and then we had a big call. And Chuck was like, I've been the guy working on the ancillary book that no one cares about. I've been the guy working on the spin-off book, and you can never do anything. You can't have any fun stories. You can't change anything. And I don't want that to happen with you. So yes. And he just was like, do it. You can do it.
That's super cool.
And then Chuck came up with the idea of like the contest to who's going to be Cobra Commander, which I can't remember what the storyline was called. I should have gone back and reread this stuff. It's been a while. But like that was all Chuck's idea of like having these different candidates. Mm-hmm. And, then I took his lead on that, and that laid into my story as well. But yeah, the idea of introducing Cobra Commander, who Cobra Commander was, we never actually find out who he actually is, but like who the character presents as, and then the character being killed, that was all me and Andy and Chuck and Hasbro being like, yeah. So it was great. It was pretty
That's
great.
Amazing that Hasbro was, said okay to all of this. The Cobra stuff you touched on, it's really fascinating because I was always very curious what the backstory was from that first Cobra Commander that we meet. I know there's a line in one of the issues that hints that he's probably like in his 50s or 60s. I think it says like they vote for a new leader every 7 years, and he's been reelected 5 times. So if you do the math, he's been a leader since his 20s, maybe later. So I was like, okay, so he's been around. And I was always, Paul Aller wrote a one-off issue that touched on a bit of a history of Cobra, like a bit later on, which I thought was quite interesting. But there were a lot of things that were kind of hinted at that never, unfortunately, I don't think we got. As a guy who reads comics every month, I'm always like, okay, I'm looking forward to this stuff. I know to see Easter eggs and things being dropped, and then when things aren't picked up, I'm like, oh, what happened? But those early days, it's great to hear about Chuck Dixon and you being able to collaborate, because I was very curious about what that IDW verse mentality was, like what was on the table, what was off the table, who was going to get to play with who, because obviously you took the Crimson Twins,
yes.
Comax and Zaymont,
yes.
And gave them the characterization that, I don't think any of us had ever seen. The name Paoli, did you come up with that?
I did. So I did all of this research. So now it's so interesting because the world has changed so much.
Yeah.
Since
I know this is a long time ago. I think where I was when I read these issues, and it's like, wow.
I mean, obviously I've changed. I've gotten older, but like the world itself has changed. So now these ideas are so much more articulate within the culture. Like politics, particularly in the U.S., have become so much more conspiratorial, and like far right and fringe conspiracies are a lot more inside the popular culture than they were 15 years ago. But I was very much going for a New World Order kind of concept with what Cobra was when Chuckles discovered it. That it was like old world, old money, people hiding behind the scenes and manipulating events through very precise and targeted situations and false flags. Like that was absolutely my conception of what Cobra should be. It felt like a more modern idea, which now, unfortunately, I mean, I don't believe there's any such organization that exists, but unfortunately there are a lot of people that do. I think there's more people now that believe that than when I was writing Cobra. But that was how I conceived of Cobra. But I also knew that like that can't last forever because it works for my like dark, heavy, espionage-y, like morally gray world. but I also understood that G.I. Joe is about like military action, and I knew it couldn't stay that way forever. So I wanted to introduce that and then allow it to become a much more active paramilitary terrorist organization that it is in the original comics and cartoon. And I knew that Chuck would be able to kill that because that's his whole bailiwick. So to answer your question about Pauli and also Erica Laten, I made that name up as well. I didn't actually make these names up. I did like research into like old 10 generation, like Merovingian families and
Yes.
like in Corsica.
In Corsica, yeah.
I took those names from that research. So, I mean, I think I changed it a little bit that there isn't actually a Pauli family, but something like that, where I wanted it to have the feeling of like, these are people who have been in power for centuries, and they're old money, old world people. So that's where those names came from. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it was like Tomax and Zaymot were always kind of like Cher or Madonna, and then now they've got a last name, and it really worked, and it added this gravitas to that character when we first meet Zaymot, and he's plotting and like bringing in Chuckles, and you think, and that's what I love about the way you built that series, where there's a lot of give and take. It's like, oh, Chuckles has the upper hand. Nope, fooled you. The Crimson Twins know what's up all along. Nope, Chuckles has the upper hand. But it all makes sense. And that twist, and we can spoil it here because I'm sure everyone knows, but when Chuckles does shoot Jinx, that was like, oh, this is real. And this is beyond, like, I don't know what to equate it to. I think of other comic things like how Alan Moore took all the old Charlton heroes and turned them into Watchmen, of course, and Frank Miller even taking Batman, but Batman, was such a well-known character, but then when the Dark Knight Returns vibe of really like darkening the character, which changed Batman's course forever. Yeah, and I feel like what you did, like instantly what you did with Chuckles, from the start of that series, we're like, okay, this is a guy who, like you said, from the G.I. Joe cartoon movie, maybe he's like, who is he? He's kind of just this big lug, is he a joke? But he's an undercover guy. And if you had the toys and knew the file card, you knew he was the G.I. Joe undercover agent, the Hawaiian shirt. But he is now, when he makes that, unforgettable, when he shoots Jinx, all bets are off. And you're like, where is this going? And instantly that character has now, I'm not sure if you're following the action figures or the current state of things, but Chuckles receives some really high profile attention now. Like there's the San Diego Comic-Con exclusive this year was a Chuckles figure. I hope yeah. And I feel that is definitely like a nod to your work on Cobra. I mean, like Chuckles has not... Like, he was instantly changed, and all these other characters, and Tomax and Zaymot, so to stick to the Crimson Twins, I was always fascinated by them. And in the cartoon, they ran extensive enterprises, and they always, they're in charge of the Crimson Guard, and the Crimson Guard always looked so cool. Yeah. So what was your, and I like your explanation in the comics, I'll let you handle that, but how did you see, like, where they fit into the whole larger scale of Cobra, and then how did you sort of pitch that to everyone else?
I don't remember exactly when some of the things I've been telling you, I remember exactly when I came up with the idea and what it was. This I don't remember as well, but I'm pretty sure it came from that initial conversation with Andy Schmidt where he said he wanted the end of the series to be, Chuckles being like, I know what Cobra is. And then realizing like, oh no, I just saw a tiny part and it's actually so huge that I was wrong. And I think that spurned the idea of like, well, he could be dealing with Tomax and Zaymot and their fiefdom and think like, oh, well, that's Cobra because it's sort of self-contained. And then realize like, no, it's way more. These aren't the guys behind the chair. There's people way above them and all over the world. And so I think that's initially why I zeroed in on Tomax and Zaymot, was specifically because in the original conception of them, they had their own sort of business, like a forward-facing, like legit business front, and they had their own personal army, which was like, a mini version of Cobra. So you could do that. And that's I think where that originally came from. And then it just, it's all in the conception of how Cobra would work. I mean, all of this stuff I just made up. I did do a lot of research into like old families, and I definitely did a lot of research into Joe characters. And every time I introduced a new Joe character, even if I was pretty confident that I knew who the character was, I still went back and read old issues to see if there was stuff that I could take or use as Easter eggs, or like bring out some shading of a character that was there that I'm, might not have been aware of otherwise. So I did do a lot of that. But in terms of like, how a terrorist organization operates, or like even how military units, I made all of that up. I had no idea. And, Chuck Dixon is so well versed, and he knows that stuff so well. And so does Larry Hama. I mean, Larry served, obviously. I don't think Chuck did serve, but he's a military history guy. Like those guys, they know that stuff.
Oh yeah.
And I knew that any amount of research that I could do in the months that I had to write this comic would not come close. So I didn't even really try. And that's also part of the reason why it helped me that, Chuckles is out there on his own. I don't have to use a lot of like, well, how would, a SEAL team infiltrate? Like, I didn't even need to know any of that stuff. I could just make up whatever Chuckles did. Though I will say, and this is the only time that I will toot my own horn, but it was such a big moment for me. I got to meet Tom King a couple years ago at San Diego at the Eisners, after the Eisners one night. And I'm a huge fan of Tom King. And if anybody knows Tom King, he actually worked in the CIA previous to being a comic book writer. And his first big book, The Sheriff of Babylon, is a lot about his experiences in Iraq. And it's one of the greatest comics of the past 15 years.
Yeah.
He came up to me.
Got it over here.
And he came up to me. He was like, Mike Costa. And I was like, yeah, nice to meet you, Tom King. And he goes, you wrote Cobra. And I go, I did. And he goes, I read that while I was in the CIA. And I was like, oh my God. And
That's
I said,
crazy.
I just made everything up. I hope it wasn't ridiculous because I was making up. He was like, no, I loved it. He didn't tell me it was realistic, but he told me he loved it. And that matters. The idea that some guy in the CIA was reading my comic book about undercover, terror, that's mind-boggling. So yeah.
Well, it's fantastic, and I mean, I'm sure if you think of all the spy stories of lore, I'm sure a lot of them weren't written by people who had CIA experience.
Yes.
But it rings so true, and that's fantastic. Definitely shout out Tom King. His Vision comic too is not CIA, but wow, I love that one.
He doesn't just write espionage. Obviously, he's
fantastic.
Writing multiple genres, but
totally. Oh yeah, but in the context here, you touched on something that I think is really poignant and relevant. And it keeps coming up. Like the great thing about G.I. Joe that I've always loved is, yes, you've got your base in this realistic military idea and modern military, always sort of on the cutting edge of things. But there's always been, going back to the 60s, there's always been this more, the outlandish side of things. And yes. I find the stories that work the best are able to incorporate both of them, where you get this really unique fusion, which is unlike any other military stories. You think of, I don't know, Sergeant Rock or something. Like, there's something that makes G.I. Joe G.I. Joe. And it is because Cobra is a bit, they're outlandish, they're wild, and however you interpret that, whether it's space aliens and mutants who live in the Himalayas, or if you interpret that as wild, the twins and what you did with Cobra and like your interpretations and the mystical cults with Serpentor and everything like that, like you have to have that other, the weirdness coupled with to balance out the modern military, and I think. Again, Cobra, it really fused those two perfectly. And with the twins, what I really enjoyed was, so these are two characters that were familiar if you watch the cartoon. Tomax and Xamot, they finished each other's sentences. They can feel when the other one gets punched, et cetera, et cetera. But you really added that with the history and like who they are and what they're, they're very... Like they're not noble, but they have this real arrogance and this esteem. And there's one scene that I was thinking of, and I reread it, and it creeps me out almost as much as the Jinx scene and the Cobra Commander scene. It's the Ortolan scene, eating the bird. Like, now that's like it's a French songbird or something. And so this is a real thing. So explain, people
So this
Great.
is,
Yeah.
I mean, shout out to my friend Nick Malice, who will probably never see this, but my comedy writer, comedian friend Nick, he told me about this. This was probably a year or two before I wrote that comic, because I think he was in France. And all of the details that I write about in that comic are real. So it's a French songbird. It's this incredible delicacy where they like cook the entire bird without gutting it or boning it. It's just the whole thing. It's like a little canary. And then you eat it whole. And then the way he explained it to me was that, as you're eating it, the bones in the bird, you're crunching on the bones, and they will cut your gums or your lip, your inside of your lip, because it's sharp, it's bones. But your own blood will then like season the food that you're eating. And the traditional way of eating it is you take your napkin and you put it over your head. And I think there's two, like one version is like because like the aroma comes up and is trapped. But then the other reason is that because what you're doing is so decadent that you are hiding from God. Like, because what you're doing is so ludicrously like indulgent that you don't want God to see that how much you're indulging yourself in this horrifying, crunching up this bird and bleeding and eating your own blood. And it was so vivid. And also, this another like French old world thing that I felt like that is going in. And part of writing comics, and it's something that you can do to an extent writing television, but it's so much, when you write a comic, you're writing it monthly. You gotta keep coming up with stuff to put on those pages, like that comic's gotta come out. So there's so much more of an opportunity to just sort of throw in whatever you're thinking about that month, or like some weird, like with Nick, some weird story that someone told me one time. And also true with comics, like the only, with something like G.I.JOE, technically you do have Hasbro, which is another barrier. But like I said, Hasbro was always so great with whatever I wanted to do. But usually with a comic, it's like you and the editor, and that's it. There's not like 20 people that have to approve of stuff. So you can put weird personal, I mean, not that the ortolan's that personal. I've never eaten it. But a story like that, it just was something that someone told me one time that I wanted to put in a comic, and you just do it. Like, that's part of what makes comic book writing so great.
Yeah, well, it fit perfectly with their characters, and you just said like ludicrously indulgent. There you go. That's Tomax and Xamot. Like
Yes.
That's them, and yeah, just what a great, like, their character arc. What was it like? Like, do you remember writing those two and then figuring out how they were, eventually going to, stab each other in the back, and like the eventual borderline redemption?
I think it was very, very early on where I knew that the person that because the other thing that you get to do with Tomax and Xamot is that they're twins. And so that's fun because it means that, you can play with the idea that the person that they're talking to doesn't know that he's talking to two people because he's only seeing one at a time, which we kind of did. I don't know how, if the reveal was all that crucial. I think the reveal works better for the reader because the reader is familiar with Tomax and Xamot. And even though we did put in some hints in the comic earlier, I'm hoping that a lot of people came to it and they were surprised to discover that Mr. X was actually mostly Xamot, but then the idea is that sometimes it was Tomax, you just never knew who. Because I knew I wanted whoever that character is that Chuckles is talking to has to be a Cobra guy that He wouldn't just be some random person. He would end up being a Cobra character. And Mr. X is a great, fake pseudonym for someone, and Xamot begins with an X, and that all worked out. And when I knew I would be doing that, then I knew that, like, well, we'll show Xamot get his scar. Like, that will be what happens, And I think that came from something about a blank going off.
Chuckles holds a gun to his.
Oh yeah. No, I'm saying I think I got the idea similarly from like hearing a story about that happening to someone or something, and that like blanks are dangerous. There's stuff coming. There's gas, superheated gas coming out of the gun. Even though it's not a bullet, it can hurt you. So that was a very early idea that I knew writing the whole thing we were coming to. And I don't remember where in the process this was, but it was when we realized knew that the line was doing well and they wanted to do more Cobra. And so the initial thing was to do the special issue, the Cobra special, which I knew would be about Tomax and Xamot. And if Xamot has a scar now, it seemed an interesting place to take the characters that, like, they used to be always on the same page because they were, like, essentially exactly the same person. But now that one of them looks different, he starts to feel alienated from his brother. And he starts to kind of take on his own personality outside of his twin. And that would be a major source of drama because Tomax would not understand it. And it's not that Xamot ever becomes a brother or a traitor or, somebody who's trying to go like join the Joes or something. But I knew that would be a great place to, like, make those characters distinct and interesting, something interesting to do with those characters who, like you said in the cartoon, they are the same person. They finish each other's sentences. They're exactly the same, except one has a scar and their costumes are like mirror images of each other. And I also like the idea that, like, our comic isn't a place where you can do the whole, you punch Tomax and Xamot feels it, but that there's a wound that one of them suffers that does cause a wound between the brothers. That felt like a more grounded version of that, like, hurt one and you hurt the other. That's kind of what happens. Chuckles hurts Xamot, and Tomax is hurt also because it ruins their relationship ultimately. Mm-hmm. And that special issue, you mentioned Watchmen. I wrote it to be a mirror, the way that issue 6 of Watchmen is the Rorschach issue, where if you look at panel 1 of page 1 and you look at panel 2 of page 22, because 1 is on the left and 2 is on the right, they would be mirror images. And you do that through the whole issue, and then there's a double page spread that's the two of them in opposite places. And that was because I didn't just want to do it with the art the way that they do in Watchmen. I wanted it to be, and they don't even really do it in Watchmen. That's the thing. That comic gets way more credit. It's not actually, the panel layouts are symmetrical, but what happens in each panel is not symmetrical with this mirrored panel. But in my comic, it is. And the language is also, where it's like, if on page 5, panel 3, they mention the North Pole, then on page 17, panel 2, they mention the South Pole. Like, I wrote that over the course of 2 nights, making myself insane. And when it was over, I was like, no one's ever done this before. This is my masterpiece. I'm going to get an Eisner for this. Like, this is good. It's the first time a G.I. Joe comic's ever going to get an Eisner. This is incredible. And then it wasn't nominated, and no one ever mentioned it. But I'm proud of it.
Didn't it win? There was an award, like an MTV award or something, right?
Yes, it did. It was named by
There
MTV,
you go.
And so I did get some recognition. That's true.
There you go.
MTV, like, hey, that's a mainstream publication. It's maybe even better than an Eisner. Because nobody in the world knows what an Eisner is, but people know what MTV is.
That's right. I mean, I didn't know MTV reviewed comics, but I guess that was...
I didn't until they gave me it, until they listed that. I was like, hey, thank you, MTV.
Hey, music and comics are my life, so I appreciate that. That's super cool. So with what happens with Xamot, he's in the submarine with Chuckles.
Yes.
Then we have Tomax out on his own. So this is sort of where you take things, because they continue. So the Cobra series ran. There were the mini-series, and then it restarted, and then things like they do with all comic book crossovers, you have to buy every issue of the different titles, and then things get confusing, and then they're like, okay, we're just going to restart it all. And it came back as Cobra Files, which was a bit more, how much of that do you remember laying out, or what your plan was for where that was going?
It's so interesting because I remember the early stuff so much more clearly. Maybe because it was all new and it was so exciting, and I knew that I was working on something that was really different and interesting, and I had all these wild ideas, and then by the time Cobra Files, I'd been doing it for a few years, and I still am very happy with Cobra Files and I like it, but I don't think it had the novelty. But I can tell you with Cobra Files that I knew that similar to Cobra, I wanted to keep it separate from the main G.I. Joe story because I knew I could, like I did originally with Cobra, like do more. And I wouldn't have to worry about like, oh, well, Chuck is doing this in the main book. Because we did do, we did the contest for who was going to be Cobra Commander. And then we did Cobra Command, which was this big like 12-part actual crossover that Chuck and I kind of plotted out together. And I wrote issues of Cobra, but they were based on a plot that we had agreed to. And, it was a real collaboration. And Cobra went back to being just me after that. By this time, Chris had left the book and I was writing it solo. But it was still like a lot of integration. So when I had we had the chance to reboot it, I was like, okay, I want to just do like a special team, that's got the classic, like we've got Xamot in prison. And it's like Hannibal Lecter, he's in our custody, but you can't trust him because he's probably plotting something, but he's also a great source of information. Or like the Blacklist, which I don't know if it was on the air yet at the time. It might have been. It might have come out. But that same concept of like, you've got a guy who knows all the secrets, but he's super dangerous. Mm-hmm. And so you create a team around him to like use that information. And that's really where that came from. And at the time, I was rereading one of my favorite authors, James Ellroy. I was rereading his Underworld trilogy, and The Cold 6000, one of his novels, takes place in Las Vegas. So that's why I said it in Las Vegas. Because I was like, that's a cool place. You don't see that a lot in G.I. Joe comics. And I thought it made sense that Xamot would own, or Tomax would own a casino, because, it's a lucrative kind of quasi-shady business.
Oh, for sure. I feel like if there wasn't a Sunbow cartoon with that plot, there should have been.
Right, and
the Cobra Casino. Yeah.
So, yeah, and that was just more opportunity for me to continue. Because at that point, I didn't necessarily have a master plot so much as I was, I had developed all these characters, Firewall and Chameleon, and to a certain extent, Lady J. And I got to keep telling stories about them. And that was sort of what I was pursuing through the Cobra files. And that was more of a seat in my pants, like, okay, what's the next arc going to be about? And who will we introduce in the next arc? And it was less planned out. I mean, I knew that it was always going to end with Tomax escaping somehow. And unfortunately, the end came a little sooner than I had necessarily expected. I think it only went like 9 issues, but, comics just weren't selling. But yeah, it was less, that initial Cobra trilogy of the Chuckle story with the Serpentor in between, that was all planned out very early on. The Cobra files and then the stuff, with Cobra Command and all those crossovers, that had to be planned out because we were working on it together. But then starting with that, after that, I did like Son of the Snake about Cobra Commander's son, and then the October Guard. A lot of that stuff was like, okay, what's the next story? Ooh, Cobra Commander's son. That's a good thing to do. And like, what will be my take on that? And it became a fun game of like, okay, well, what's the, G.I. Joe IDW Cobra version of this story? And that was the real fun that I was having working on the book then, of coming up with that, like, who are the October Guard in this universe? And who is Flint? Flint was always my favorite character as a kid. I liked him so much more than Duke. I think because Duke seemed like a dick to me, but Flint seemed... And I always thought that Lady J was cooler than Scarlet. And I don't know if this is even true, but in my mind, it was like Duke and Scarlet were an item, but Flint and Lady J, that probably wasn't in the cartoon, but it was in my young kid brain. So I always liked Flint, and I got to bring in Flint, and I really liked the idea of bringing in like a Captain America type guy into this world where he does not belong. Like everyone in this world is super morally compromised, but Flint is not, and he has to figure that out. And like, so it was stories like that that really kept me going on the book. It was less of a big plan that I had.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm with you. I always loved Flint. And again, another reason I loved the Cobra series, because these were the characters we didn't get in every other book. I've read Duke comics a million times. It was great, but that's because, and you said early on, it's, G.I. Joe has such a pantheon of characters. Yes. Why would we just keep using the same 12 characters over and over again when you have all these great guys just sitting there ready to be like explored? Skullbuster.
Yes.
So Skullbuster, I'm very curious, and I do actually want to talk more about Chameleon as well. But how did you land on him? Because I liked him as a figure. I was like, this is like a purple range viper. He's just kind of weird. And then there was, I think he was touched on briefly in the Devil's Due comics, but we hadn't really. And it was like, this guy's kind of a badass. And then you guys made him the ultimate badass in that. In like, actually, it's still, that story is pretty disturbing.
Yeah, I think that was still Chris at the time.
Was that Chris? It was back to back, I think, with the Crocmaster, so he may have done that.
Yeah. That Serpentor story was a little unfocused because we didn't have enough of the cult to really carry like a 5-issue or 4-issue story, however long it was. So instead it became these little vignettes, and one of the vignettes became the Skullbuster. But yeah, I'm pretty sure it was Chris coming up with that of like, yeah, I want to do like a training thing. And like Skullbuster's like the scariest dude. He's the guy that they send to like really, show how bad, like you really put these guys through hell. And that was definitely a Chris idea. He was really, really involved in the Serpentor story more than almost any other story for sure. Like I said, he solo wrote Crocmaster. He got really into the spirit of like looking up G.I. Joe characters and being like, oh, this guy. I think he also was Venomous Maximus. Like he was like, we gotta do Venomous Maximus. This character's crazy.
He is crazy because the original Venomous Maximus, I believe, was like a clone of Hawk or something.
Yes, it was something bizarre.
Something bizarre. Speaking of, you're saying Duke, you felt he was always kind of a jerk. You made Hawk kind of a jerk in the comic.
Yeah, and that was definitely, there was definitely a choice because I was like, well, here's a guy, he's got to send these people essentially to their deaths. Like, and he knows that like what he's asking people to do is kind of monstrous, like, and he's got to take that on himself because that's what it takes to, or at least that's what he believes it takes to defeat these people, the threats in the world. Like you need somebody who's almost as bad. But I tried to give Hawk, the way that, like I said, it was originally mapped out as a trilogy, but in between each series there's a single issue. It gets a little convoluted because the final single issue is like Cobra 13. It's not its own special, and the first two are. But that was also very specifically structured, where the first special issue is Tomax and Xamot, the bad guys. The second special issue is Chameleon. It's a bad guy becoming a good guy. And then the final special issue is Hawk, a good guy ostensibly. And that's another thing you get to do in comics is like structure stories where, because they're individual issues, you can break POVs. And TV shows do this, but it's less easy to do. And it's something that a big inspiration for me was Bill Willingham's Fables, that he would do these long story arcs and then do an issue from a completely random character's point of view that doesn't even have anything to do with the main story. And then 3 storylines later, that person's in it. And I love that you can do that with comics. And so I did that, and, I got to tell a story about Hawk that hopefully gave you, and it was also a story about Chuckles too, because it's Chuckles' letter to Hawk, obviously, where maybe it gives you some insight into who this guy is and why he had to do that. But yeah, he had to be a dick. He had to be. Yeah. Also, he probably personally was. It's just like, oh, I don't want to do this. I have to. I think that's what it is. Yeah.
No, and I love that. And honestly, had you done a Cobra series that was just a spotlight single issue every month, I think that would have been great. Or like done it every, it was just, they were always very welcome. I was like, these are always great and well thought out. And I'd like to talk to Christos one day, and I'll bug him about the Serpentor stuff. And I'm a fan of his work too as well. And your other work, like on Transformers and things like that. So I had read, I think when Cobra came out, I had been reading the Transformers stuff, but maybe I hadn't paid attention as much to things. I was like, oh, Mike Costa, what else has he written? And I went back and found, I know you did a few spotlight issues and things. And I remember reading the Ironhide comic when it came out, and I thought that was really, really good. And I know this is a G.I. Joe thing, but I mean, I thought it was all the stuff was really cool, but I was like, oh, great. And this was another way of like, and what I liked about IDW in general, about what they were doing with these Hasbro properties, was exploring, going a bit deeper, going beyond those other characters. So how did that come about when you worked on Ironhide?
So that I would say, I mentioned the Bill Willingham fables. Definitely the thing that most typified that was Transformers. I structured my Transformers run to be like Bill Willingham's fables. Like you do an arc, and then you do an individual issue about some character, and then you do another arc, and then you do like a two-parter. And the Ironhide thing was, I knew that we were going to kill Ironhide in the first issue because it's like a big shocking death. But then we were building up what the Transformers mythology was and how it all sort of worked, and I came up with this idea that he could come back to life, but he'd be rebooted, but it would be a younger version of him because that was the last version that was like saved, and so he could come back, but he wouldn't remember anybody or anything. And also in the IDW universe at the time, Cybertron was like a burnt out shell that was infested with all these like Insecticon type things. And I really wanted to go back to Cybertron and include Cybertron in stories. And so that was a way to do that, of like, well, the Ironhide story of him coming back to life will be, he's the toughest Transformer. He's the toughest Autobot. So he's going to take on a planet full of Insecticons and like defeat them. And it was also a way to bring in Metroplex, which is a character that I had more plans for. And Alpha Trion, I had more, not Alpha Trion. Alpha Trion. That's who it was. Yeah. I had more plans for those characters that never came to fruition because that was something where the publishing plan started to change and they wanted to do different things. And I left the book, not on bad terms, but I just saw that like they wanted to branch off in different areas and I wasn't probably going to be able to tell the story I intended. So I left that book a little earlier than I was planning, but not in a way that was like I was upset about. But yeah, the Ironhide thing, so my Transformers run among Transformers fans is controversial. I feel like my G.I. Joe run is very beloved among G.I. Joe fans, which I'm very grateful for. But my Transformers run, Transformers fans are a different kind of fan than G.I. Joe fans. And there's a lot more intensity, and I think there's a lot more dedication to different versions of, Simon Furman's Transformers, or like some people, they're dedicated to the various cartoons or the file cards, and they're all kind of different. And I didn't have as much love for my series, but the thing that I feel like is the most loved is that Ironhide series.
It's great.
And I would say the artist Casey Collier, I just wanted to call him out because the art we were getting back for that was so good that for the final issue, I knew it was going to be like a big slugfest between Ironhide and like a million Insecticons. They're technically not Insecticons, but whatever. And I just said to Casey, look, man, this is going to be like a 10-page fight sequence. What if I just tell you basically what happens and then you draw it however you want? Because for people that might not know, when you write a comic book, when you write what's called full script, I'm writing like page 1, panel 1, close up of Ironhide. He's angry. Panel 2, wide shot. We're in the med bay. He's getting up off. I describe everything panel by panel. But Casey was doing such an incredible job that I was like, hey, man, I'm just going to sort of like write the beats of the action and then you decide how to draw it. And I've never done that with another artist before. And he just did such an amazing job. That art is so good. It's some of my favorite art that I've ever had in a comic that I wrote.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's great. I had the issues, and I do have the trade pape. Yeah, and it's really nice. And I've got it's going through them here. It's very nice, and I've got like the Cobra stuff here. Yeah,
you do me a favor and open up the Ironhide, and I'm so embarrassed. The colorist, she was a woman. What is the name of the colorist?
Alrighty, Joanna LaFuente.
Joanna LaFuente. Yeah, she and Casey both just crushed it. Yeah.
Highly recommend if people have not read this, because I know we got a lot of Joe fans watching this. The Cobra. So the Serpentor story, it's interesting because again, I have this, like, I have your comics in like 3 different versions. I've got the single issues,
that-
this beautiful hardcover.
I pushed them for that. I wanted that so bad, and they did it. I'm not going to say they did it for me, but I begged them that they would put the whole Chuckle story in 1 volume, and they did. I'm so glad.
Yeah. At this point, I think I'd had it in the other versions and the soft covers. And it's interesting because this covers the full Chuckle story, which is, reading it like this, the way it builds, and it's amazing. It's wild to think that you did start as this 4-part miniseries, but then it just becomes such a complete story. Yeah. And, like anyone, I write as well, and, devouring media, film, novels, whatever. My biggest pet peeve, when you read, I'm sure like everyone, when a story doesn't conclude well. And there's authors that I've just stopped reading because I'm like, they never know how to finish a story. But yeah. I will say that these finish perfectly, like just as well as they start. And it's like, you've always thought it through, and the payoff is worth the entire adventure. I told you I'd be gushing over you. I mean, it's been like 15 years almost.
It has.
When was this? 2009? What year are we in? 2023? I mean, it's crazy. So, and it's so, I'm really cognizant of your time, and I appreciate you.
Yeah. I mean, I was 28. I was still in my 20s working on that comic. I was working for a director named Martin Campbell. Who probably best known for doing Casino Royale, the first Daniel Craig James Bond movie. But he also did Goldeneye, the first Pierce Brosnan James Bond. He was the only director to launch 2 different James Bonds. I was working in his office. He was shooting a movie called Edge of Darkness with Mel Gibson. He was shooting in Boston, and they needed somebody to just sit in his office in Los Angeles just in case stuff came in to sign for or phone calls, and his assistant was a good friend of mine, and so she gave me that job because I still needed a day job. I wasn't making enough money, writing comics. But it was the best because I just sat in an empty office. Literally, the whole building was empty. It was this weird building in Santa Monica that was like 3 stories, and like I don't know what used to be in there, but we were the only occupied office. So it was me in this building alone. And, he's shooting, so it's not like he's calling me all the time. So I would just walk around this empty building and think and Google G.I. Joe stuff. And that's where I wrote most of the first part of G.I. Joe Cobra. The first 4 issues was working that job. And the comic would not be as good if I didn't have that job where I could spend all day Googling old French names and, who is... Big Boa, who I brought into. Big Boa is my favorite character that I incorporated because, he was supposed to be the Rocky villain when Rocky was going to be a G.I. Joe character. And they got rid of Rocky, but they kept Big Boa, who is clearly named after Balboa. That's why it's so stupid. I loved it. Yeah.
It's so funny. They kept the boa. It's like with the Cleveland Guardians, who used to be the Cleveland Indians. I don't know if you're a baseball fan. I joked that their jerseys, they could keep one side, the part that said Dians, and then they just changed the first part, right? It's like, we like Balboa, we can keep the... Yeah, it's not that big a change. Not that big a jump. Well, the way you handled Big Boa was so great. Were there any characters that you wanted to get to and you never got the chance to give them that Costa Cobra treatment, if you will?
That's a good question. It's definitely true of... Hi, my dog needed to sit in my lap. She was scratching at me. This is Desi.
Hey, Desi. We love dogs here.
See, it was definitely true in Transformers. So I'll reveal this. Ultimately, I wanted to get to Unicron in my Transformers run, and Alpha Trion and Metroplex were going to tie into that in a very big way. That's why I introduced them in the Ironhide thing. But it was clear that Hasbro wanted to do other stuff, and they wanted to start using like Or 13 and all this stuff with like the old... I don't even remember. It was like deep Transformers lore that I wasn't that familiar with, and that's why I ended up leaving the book, and I never got to do Unicron. I think they did get to Unicron eventually with the James Roberts and John Barber stuff, which those guys are great. I mean, they took those books and made them something better than I ever would have.
Love their stuff, yeah. John Barber, man. Yeah, I met him. He was, early
He's-
on. He
he's
was
such a great
very
guy.
cool to me. Yeah. I think I met Andy Schmidt like years before I think when he was with Marvel, but that's other stuff. But yeah, great.
So
It seems like you had a great crew around at that
absolutely,
era.
and that's really why those comics were so good, because they had such great editorial. And like I said, Michael Kelly at Hasbro, like, was just such a great guy and really cared about making the comics good and had good taste and knew what was good. Which not a lot of licensed comics have someone like that in the pipeline that cares. So anyway, that doesn't really answer your question. It answers the Transformers question, which you didn't ask. In terms of G.I. Joe,
I want to know it all. It's cool.
I don't think so. I remember really being excited to use Crystal Ball. Like, I knew how I would use Crystal Ball and make him like this Rasputin type character. And like I said, Big Boa, because it was just so dumb, the character Big Boa, and using him. And who do we eventually get to? Like, those are the last really wild characters, I feel like, that I really incorporate. I mean, the October Guard, but I had less. Yeah, no, or I guess Cobra Commander's son was kind of the last really like vaguely kind of like obscure, strange character that very different the way I used him. And then I came back to that character in Snake Eyes, Agent of Cobra, which was the last thing I did for G.I. Joe. And I probably would have done more after that, but they were just changing the whole line. And that was when they integrated the Transformers with G.I. Joe. And I never really understood how that was going to work. Not that they even asked me. I mean, at that point, I was not really writing for them anymore. So it's not like they came to me and I was like, I can't do this. They didn't ask. But yeah.
I don't think the readers really gravitated to that stuff either.
I don't think so either. I think that's why they got rid of it. After things started changing a lot. They were doing a lot of reboots after that, which, sort of left behind the G.I. Joe that I was writing. But yeah, I wish I had a better answer, but I kind of got, towards the end of Cobra Files, it was the only time I invented a major character was this guy Clock Spring. Yeah. Because I needed like a tech guy, and I didn't want to use mainframe, and there were a couple other options, but I felt like I had mentioned this character because I liked the name Clock Spring. I think he's briefly mentioned in an earlier issue where I just needed like a tech guy name. Mm-hmm. And I used that instead of like actually digging and finding another obscure character. The only thing I really regret was in the original 4 issues miniseries, Chuckles is dealing with this guy named Simeon, who's like a big Russian dude that he's like kind of becomes like his quasi friend. And Simeon is nobody. He's just like a guy. And I regret not figuring out an actual Cobra guy for that character to be, but I didn't. He's just like, he's the one kind of important character in the story that is like not a Cobra character. And I kind of regret that.
Well, maybe, you can do a backstory and figure it out. It's like, actually, you know what? He was I don't know. He was a former flak viper. I don't know. Yeah. That's fascinating. And it's cool. You mentioned Michael Kelly. I've heard his name thrown around a lot. I've never met him, but I've always been curious as well because, Star Wars has someone who guards the canon, right? Yes. And so when you say, okay, well, this comic actually is part of the canon. Oh, now this is et cetera, et cetera. We all know that Star Wars universe and how the video games and the TV shows and how everything's like, oh, well, this all fits in together. Yes. So I was curious if Hasbro did have someone who was sort of like a lore guardian, for lack of a better term.
They didn't. They didn't when I was writing G.I. Joe, but I think once they started rebranding themselves as like an entertainment company, because they were still very much a toy company that published comics and had IP, like the G.I. Joe movie, obviously, and the Transformers movies had been around for a while, but, the Michael Bay ones, because the first one came out in like 2005 or something. I can't remember exactly, but it had been out for a few years. Because I was working on Transformers when Revenge of the Fallen came out. But they really, like everything in Hollywood started really rebranding as like multi-platform, multimedia companies. And I think when they did that, they became a lot more invested in controlling the narrative of their own IPs. Whereas when I was there, luckily, Michael Kelly was like, hey man, whatever story you want to tell. And he just happened to be a fan of what I was doing and was like, keep doing it. He didn't have to run it by the lore master and make sure that it all fit. But I do think that they started heading towards that after I left. I know that for a while, Andy Schmidt, who was the editor at IDW, he left a little bit into my run, and he was replaced by John Barber, actually. He went and worked at Hasbro for a while. And one of his job there was to be an IP guy and help develop other IPs and what they could do. He wasn't necessarily about protecting the lore, but he was like, hey, Inhumanoids, you guys have got this. Here's some ideas of what we can do with it and stuff like that. So I think they started really getting more aggressive about that and then having people internally watch it in a way they didn't when I was there, which is good because they probably never let me do what I did if they had a guy like that,
That's fascinating. Yeah, and that's interesting to know. Yeah, I used to listen to Andy's podcast and stuff, and he always seemed like a pretty, with that comics experience and everything.
Yeah, the comics, yes, yeah.
Yeah. But sorry, John Barber went to Hasbro or Andy?
Andy went to Hasbro.
Yeah,
John Barber
makes sense. Yeah,
took over at IDW when Andy left.
Yeah, I do remember that. And his stuff, he was writing one of the Transformer books too. And yeah, I was reading all that stuff at the time, and it was fantastic stuff. Is there anything else that we didn't touch on? I know this has been, you've given us so much time tonight.
No, it's been great. It's, I should have reread. It's weird. I don't go back and reread my stuff, and it's not because I'm embarrassed about it, but it's because, I don't know, it's almost like, how do I want to explain it? You savor waiting to do something, because I know that once I go back and reread it, it'll be fresh in my mind again, and then it'll take me forever to forget. And I like having distance from my own stuff and then reading it again and being like, oh, this is what I was thinking at the time. This is what I was doing. And having that be a fresh experience for myself. So I actually haven't reread Cobra since I was originally working on it. And only last year or the year before did I go back and reread my Transformers stuff. But I should go back and reread Cobra now that we're talking about it, because I think part of it too was that I love Cobra so much. I think it still might be my favorite thing I've ever done in comics. I worked on a comic called Web Warriors for Marvel, which was kind of like Spider-Verse before the Spider-Verse movie.
Ben Reilly, right? Yeah,
Ben Reilly.
Yeah, I read that. Yeah.
The Spider-Verse movie was a lot better. It was a lot better than what I wrote, but I had so much fun writing that comic. And the only other comparable thing was G.I. Joe, because I don't know, it was just such a great creative time in my life. I remember, it was the first time I could quit a day job and work just writing comics. And, I would go home and visit my parents for Christmas in Michigan, where I'm from, and be sitting at their little dining room table. And that's where I would write all day over the Christmas break, because I would try to get ahead when I was home. And I sat in this chair so much that I broke the back of the dining room chair because I would constantly rock back when I wrote. And I don't know, those are just memories of a really creative, fertile time that now working in Hollywood and stuff, it's just a lot more cynical and a lot more sort of systematic, and a lot of work that you don't know where it's going to go, or you're doing notes that don't make sense, or, and when I was writing Cobra, I was just writing Cobra, and whatever I wrote was getting drawn and published, and it was a really wonderful time. Thank you for helping me remember. This is getting weird and sentimental, but thank you.
No, this is great, man. Listen, comics are the best medium, and that's so fantastic, and it's freeing, and you never have to worry about a budget when you can just throw anything into a comic. Helicopters, aircraft carriers, whatever.
If this is for a G.I. Joe audience, then I'm sure that a lot of people come to G.I. Joe through the cartoons or through the toys, or the comics, but a lot of people just read the G.I. Joe comics. And if I can inspire anyone out there to read more comics, because unfortunately the industry is not in a great spot and things are contracting in a real serious way. And most series that begin don't last more than 8 or 9 12 issues now. You're lucky to get to 12 issues before sales drop to the point where that, I mean, comics still exist and comics are still sold, but to get momentum to keep a series going the way that Cobra did, it just doesn't happen today. And it's not like I'm some old timer. This was a decade ago,
Yep.
So I would like it if comics were healthier. So anyone watching this, there's a lot of great stuff out there. Find me on Twitter or on Blue Sky. I will give you recommendations. We've got to read more comics.
Absolutely. Mike, thank you so much. This has been an absolute pleasure. Chuckles had so many great one-liners. Any one-liners you want to sign off with?
Oh, man.
Not to put you on the spot.
Sure. No, I just froze.
I think I was never leaving here. That he says, you're never leaving. They're going to pull you back in.
Yeah, I hope
like
so.
Chuckles said something like that. Like he had so many, my weakness. Like, look, I'm just gonna pull one out because I bet I could flip to any page and find something.
There's a scene in the beginning of the third Cobra series.
Look how good this stuff is. Sorry, what scene? What scene do you want me to
talk
flip
about
to?
Antonio at all? Antonio Fusto, the Italian maniac who he is so awesome. His art is so incredible. Yeah, that's good stuff.
It's beautiful. I hope you have this hardcover kicking around somewhere.
I do. I have a couple.
Good.
There's a scene in the beginning of the first issue of Cobra 3 where, he's like been brought into the fold and everybody hates him and no one knows why he's there and they all want to kill him. And then he's told that Cobra Commander wants to see him and he gets up and he's like, gotta go, boss wants to see me. And he's having such a fun time rubbing it in these people's faces that like, he knows that they hate him and they want to kill him, but he's also in his inside he's just like a nihilist who's like he could die at any moment and he doesn't care. In my mind, there's a show called Arrested Development that I'm sure you've heard of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know it.
There's this really random scene that probably nobody remembers where Alia Shawkat's character, she's always trying to do stuff to get her parents to notice her, and she's like packing a suitcase to run away. And her mom comes in and she's like, "Maybe what are you doing?" She's like, "Packing it up, just packing it on up." And her mom just completely does not notice. And that was in my mind when I was writing that Chuckles line of like, that was his delivery of like, just gotta go, boss wants to see me. Like, anyway, that's so weird and random and stupid, but that's a moment that for whatever reason sticks in my mind of Chuckles being obnoxious and funny.
That's the best way to sign off. I've got a baby in the other room and they're the boss right now. So I'm like, yep, gotta go. Boss wants to see me.
That's even better. Oh, that's so good. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's been an absolute pleasure. So great to finally connect, face to face, not like Tomax and Zaymont.
Thank you for being a fan for so long and, writing that amazing song and, other stuff that you write is also amazing. But, the fact that I wrote something and then someone's like, this inspired me to write a song. That's wild, man. That's wild.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's the best. Thank you. All right.
Undercover to expose the core. Go to extremes in the process. Undercover to expose the core. The real definition of what a snake is. Undercover to expose the core. Go to extremes in the process. Undercover to expose the core. The real definition of what a snake is.
Quick wit and a fast tongue. Yeah, guess I'm my dad's son. Only weaknesses are women and bad puns. Call me Chuckles, never left a job half done. Go ahead and laugh, I'll be sure I get the last one. Quick wit and a fast tongue, my dad's son. Only weaknesses are women and bad puns. Call me Chuckles, never left a job half done. Go ahead and laugh, I'll be sure I get the last one. A past? None. They took my life away from me for the mission. Had to let it go painfully. Gainfully employed from busting drugs and tracking pimps to arms dealers in the Balkans, hijacking blimps. Undercover so long, they all forgot who I work for, where I've been, what I've seen, and had to murk for. The mission's all I got, living off a dirt floor, and I'd probably burn right now if you walk me through a church door. In my line of work, it's hard not to cast aspersions. Just keep telling yourself you're not a bad person. Elaborate diversions, life in deep cover, prepared to sacrifice even each other. I lost a lover, you can't question my next move. This is my final report, nothing left to lose. A clever dude and I'm taking this island with me. If it's the last thing I do, and it will be.
Better find out before you time's out. Time's out.
Quick wit and a fast tongue, my dad's son. Only weaknesses are women and bad puns. Call me Chuckles, never left a job half done. Go ahead and laugh, I'll be sure I get the last one.
Jokes on you, Jack. Jokes on you, Jack. Jokes on you, Jack.
I worked my way in from the gutters, all the way up to high command. Chump wheelman to the commander's right hand. Off the land, off the grid, transmitter in my head. So in theory, they can even listen when I'm dead. Now there's a reason I'm the man that the general sent. Silently creeping in the tents, nobody's ever went deeper. Yeah, collecting more intel from foreign cells. Ignored the warning bells. Shot through the door to hell just to pass in my application. And only got time for one last assassination. But kill one snake, another takes its place. That's why I'm in this nuclear sub, about to lay to waste. 5 square miles of reptiles and reprobates. Fingers on the trigger, and my girl won't let me hesitate. This is why she died, now I can see it clear. Should've known when I arrived, I was never leaving here.
Came through the door, came through the door, came through the door. My mind was thinking all out war, thinking all out war, thinking all out war. I'ma settle the score, 1 cent for all.
Quick wit and a fast tongue, yeah, guess I'm my dad's son. Only weaknesses are women and bad puns. Call me Chuckles, never left the job half done. Go ahead and laugh, I'll be sure I get the last one. Quick wit and a fast tongue, my dad's son. Only weaknesses are women and bad puns. Call me Chuckles, never left the job half done. Go ahead and laugh, I'll be sure I get the last one.